All right. So this is the ReEducation project, book one, biology. So let's go ahead and open up OpenStax. Oops, cancel. Let's go here. All right. Biology will be down here. 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 All right. View online. So table of contents. Already read through that. So the first section is the chemistry of life. Chapter 1, the study of life. Introduction. And then there's 1.1, the science of biology. 1.2, themes and concepts of biology. That's what I plan on reading today. Figure 1.1. I won't talk about I'll just do kind of brief overview of the figure. Okay, chapter outline. 1.1, the science of biology. 1.2, themes and concepts of biology. Viewed from space, Earth offers no clues about the diversity of life forms that reside there. Scientists believe that the first forms of life on Earth were microorganisms that existed for billions of years in the ocean before plants and animals appeared. The mammals, birds, and flowers so familiar to us are all relatively recent, originating 130 to 250 million years ago. The earliest representatives of the genus Homo, to which we belong, have inhabited this planet for only the last 2.5 million years, and only in the last 300,000 years have humans started looking like we do today. Boop. Next page. 1.1, the science of biology. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to do the following. Identify the shared characteristics of the natural sciences, summarize the steps of the scientific method, compare inductive reasoning with deductive reasoning, describe the goals of basic science and applied science. What is biology? In simple terms, biology is the study of life. This is a very broad definition because the scope of biology is vast. Biologists may study anything from the microscopic or submicroscopic view of a cell to ecosystems and the whole living planet. Listening to the daily news, you will quickly realize how many aspects of biology we discuss every day. For example, recent news topics includes Escherichia coli, that's E. coli, outbreaks in spinach and salmonella, contamination in peanut butter. Other subjects include effort toward finding a cure for AIDS, Alzheimer's disease, and cancer. On a global scale, many researchers are committed to finding ways to protect the planet, solve environmental issues, and reduce the effects of climate change. All of these diverse endeavors are related to different facets of the discipline of biology. The process of science. Biology is a science, but what exactly is a science, or is science? What does the study of biology share with other scientific disciplines? We can define science from the Latin scientia, meaning knowledge, as knowledge that covers general truths or the operation of general laws, especially when acquired and tested by the scientific method. It becomes clear from this definition that applying scientific method plays a major role in science. The scientific method is a method of research with defined steps that include experiments and careful observations. We will examine scientific method steps in detail later, but one of the most important aspects of this method is the testing of hypotheses by means of repeatable experiments. A hypothesis is a suggested explanation for an event which one can test. Although using the scientific method is inherent to science, it is inadequate in determining what science is. This is because it is relatively easy to apply the scientific method to disciplines such as physics and chemistry, but when it comes to disciplines like archaeology, psychology, and geology, the scientific method becomes less applicable as repeating experiments becomes more difficult. These areas of study are still sciences, however. Consider archaeology. Even though one cannot perform repeatable experiments, hypotheses may still be supported. For instance, archaeologists can hypothesize that an ancient culture existed based on finding a piece of pottery. They could find or could make further hypotheses about various characteristics of this culture, which could be correct or false through continued support or contradictions from other findings. A hypothesis may become a verified theory. A theory is a tested and confirmed explanation for observations or phenomena. Therefore, we may be better off to define science as fields of study that attempt to comprehend the nature of the universe. Natural sciences. What would you expect to see in a museum of natural science? Frogs, plants, dinosaur skeletons, exhibits about how the brain functions, a planetarium, gems and minerals, maybe all of the above? Science includes such diverse fields as astronomy, biology, computer sciences, geology, logic, physics, chemistry, and mathematics. However, scientists consider those fields of science related to the physical world and its phenomena and processes natural sciences. Thus, a museum of natural sciences might contain any of the items listed above. There is no complete agreement. Sorry. There is no complete agreement when it comes to defining what the natural sciences include, however. For some experts, the natural sciences are astronomy, biology, chemistry, earth science, and physics. Other scholars choose to divide the natural sciences into life sciences, which study living things and include biology, and physical sciences, which study non living matter and including astronomy, geology, physics, and chemistry. Some disciplines, such as biophysics and biochemistry, build on both life and physical sciences and are interdisciplinary. Some refer to natural sciences as hard science because they rely on the use of quantitative data. Social sciences that study society and human behavior are more likely to use qualitative measurements or assessments to drive investigations and findings. Not surprisingly, the natural science of biology has many branches or subdisciplines. Hold on. Close that up. Cell biologists study cell structure and function, while biologists who study anatomy investigate the structure of an entire organism. Those biologists studying physiology, however, focus on the internal functioning of an organism. Some areas of biology focus on only one particular type of living thing. For example, botanists explore plants, while zoologists specialize in animals. Take a little drink. Okay. Scientific reasoning. One thing is common to all forms of science, an ultimate goal to know. Curiosity and inquiry are the driving forces for the development of science. Scientists seek to understand the world and the way it operates. To do this, they use two methods of logical thinking: inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is a form of logical thinking that uses related observations to arrive at a general conclusion. This type of reasoning is common in descriptive science. A life scientist, such as a biologist, makes observations and records them. These data can be qualitative or quantitative, and one can supplement the raw data with drawings, pictures, photos, or videos. From many observations, the scientists can infer conclusions, inductions, based on evidence. Inductive reasoning involves formulating generalizations inferred from careful observations and analyzing a large amount of data. Brain studies provide an example. In this type of research, scientists observe many live brains while people are engaged in a specific activity, such as viewing images of food. The scientist then predicts the part of the brain that lights up during this activity to be the part controlling the response to the selected stimulus. In this case, images of food, excess absorption of radioactive sugar derivatives by active areas of the brain causes the various areas to light up. Scientists use a scanner to observe the resultant increase in radioactivity. Then researchers can stimulate that part of the brain to see if similar responses result. Deductive reasoning, or deduction, is the type of logic used in hypothesis-based science. In deductive reasoning, the pattern of thinking moves in the opposite direction as compared to inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is a form of logical thinking that uses a general principle or law to predict specific results. From those general principles, a scientist can deduce and predict the specific results that would be valid as long as the general principles are valid. Studies in climate change can illustrate this type of reasoning. For example, scientists may predict that if the climate becomes warmer in a particular region, then the distribution of plants and animals should change. Both types of logical thinking are related to the two main pathways of scientific study: descriptive science and hypothesis based science. Descriptive or discovery science, which is usually inductive, aims to observe, explore, and discover, while hypothesis based science, which is usually deductive, begins with a specific question or problem and a potential answer or solution that one can test. The boundary between these two forms of study is often blurred, and most scientific endeavors combine both approaches. The fuzzy boundary becomes apparent when thinking about how easily observation can lead to specific questions. For example, a gentleman in the 1940s observed that the burr seeds that stuck to his clothes and his dog's fur had a tiny hook structure. On closer inspection, he discovered that the burr's gripping device was more reliable than a zipper. He eventually experimented to find the best material that acted similarly and produced the hook and loop fastener popularly known today as Velcro. The scientific method. Biologists studying the living world by posing questions about it and seeking science-based responses. Known as scientific method, this approach is common to other sciences as well. The scientific method was used even in ancient times, but England's Sir Francis Bacon first documented it. He set up inductive methods for scientific inquiry. The scientific method is not used only by biologists. Researchers from almost all fields of study can apply it as a logical, rational problem-solving method. The scientific process typically starts with an observation, often a problem to solve, that leads to a question. Let's think about a simple problem that starts with an observation and apply the scientific method to solve the problem. One Monday morning, a student arrives at class and quickly discovers that the classroom is too warm. That is an observation that also describes a problem. The classroom is too warm. The student then asks a question: why is the classroom so warm? Proposing a hypothesis. Recall that a hypothesis is a suggested explanation that one can test. To solve a problem, one can propose several hypotheses. For example, one hypothesis might be the classroom is warm because no one turned on the air conditioning. However, there could be other responses to the question, and therefore one may propose other hypotheses. A second hypothesis might be the classroom is warm because there is a power failure, and so the air conditioning doesn't work. Once one has selected a hypothesis, the student can make a prediction. A prediction is similar to a hypothesis, but it typically has the format if-then. For example, a prediction for the first hypothesis might be, if the student turns on the air conditioning, then the classroom will no longer be too warm. Testing a hypothesis. A valid hypothesis must be testable. It should also be falsifiable, meaning that experimental results can disprove it. Importantly, science does not claim to prove anything because scientific understandings are always subject to modification with further information. This step, openness to disproving ideas, is what distinguishes sciences from non-sciences. The presence of the supernatural, for instance, is neither testable nor falsifiable. To test a hypothesis, a researcher will continue one or more experiments designed to eliminate one or more of the hypotheses. Each experiment will have one or more variables and one or more controls. A variable is any part of the experiment that can vary or change during the experiment. The control group contains every feature of the experimental group except it is not given the manipulation that the researcher hypothesizes. Therefore, if the experimental group's results differ from the control group, the difference must be due to the hypothesized manipulation rather than some outside factor. Look for the variables and controls in the examples that follow. To test that first hypothesis, the student would find out if the air conditioning is on. If the air conditioner is turned on but does not work, there should be another reason. and the student should reject this hypothesis. To test the failure or second hypothesis, the student should check if the lights in the classroom are functional. If so, there is no power failure, and the student should reject this hypothesis. The students should test each hypothesis by carrying out appropriate experiments. Be aware that rejecting one hypothesis does not determine whether or not one can accept the other hypothesis. It simply eliminates one hypothesis that is not valid. Using the scientific method, the student rejects the hypotheses that are inconsistent with experimental data. While this warm classroom example is based on observational results, other hypotheses and experiments might have clearer controls. For example, a student might attend a class on Monday and realize she had difficulty concentrating on the lecture. One observation to explain this occurrence might be, when I eat breakfast before class, I am better able to pay attention. The student could then design an experiment with a control to test this hypothesis. In hypothesis-based science, researchers predict specific results from a general premise. We call this type of reasoning deductive reasoning. Deduction proceeds from the general to the particular. However, the reverse of the process is also possible. Sometimes scientists reach a general conclusion from a number of specific observations. We call this type of reasoning inductive reasoning, and it proceeds from the particular to the general. Researchers often use inductive and deductive reasoning in tandem to advance scientific knowledge. In recent years, a new approach of testing hypotheses has developed as a result of an exponential growth of data deposited in various databases. Using computer algorithms and statistical analyses of data in databases, a new field of so-called data research, also referred to as in silico research, provides new methods of data analyses and their interpretation. This will increase the demand for specialists in both biology and computer science, a promising career opportunity. Some connections. The scientific method may seem too rigid and structured. It is important to keep in mind that although scientists often follow this sequence, there is flexibility. Sometimes an experiment leads to conclusions that favor a change in approach. Often, an experiment brings entirely new scientific questions to the puzzle. Many times, science does not operate in a linear fashion. Instead, sorry, I lost my place. Instead, scientists continually draw inferences and make generalizations, finding patterns as their research proceeds. Scientific reasoning is more complex than the scientific method alone suggests. Notice, too, that we can apply the scientific method to solving problems that aren't necessarily scientific in nature. Two types of science: basic science and applied science. The scientific community has been debating for the last few decades about the value of different types of science. Is it valuable to pursue science for the sake of simply gaining knowledge? Or does scientific knowledge only have worth if we can apply it to solving a specific problem or to bettering our lives? This question focuses on the differences between two types of science: basic science and applied science. Basic science, or pure science, seeks to expand knowledge regardless of the short-term application of that knowledge. It is not focused on developing a product or a service or immediate public or commercial value. The immediate goal of basic science is knowledge for knowledge's sake, although this does not mean that, in the end, it may not result in a practical application. In contrast, applied science, or technology, aims to use science to solve real-world problems, making it possible, for example, to improve crop yield, find a cure for a particular disease, or save animals threatened by a natural disaster. In applied science, the problem is usually defined for the researcher. Some individuals may perceive applied science as useful and basic science as useless. A question these people might pose to a scientist advocating knowledge acquisition would be, what for? However, a careful look at the history of science reveals that basic knowledge has resulted in many remarkable applications of great value. Many scientists think that a basic understanding of science is necessary before researchers develop an application. Therefore, applied science relies on the results that researchers generate through basic science. Other scientists think that it is time to move on from basic science in order to find solutions to actual problems. Both approaches are valid. It is true that there are problems that demand immediate attention. However, scientists would find few solutions without the help of the wide knowledge foundation that basic science generates. One example of how basic and applied science can work together to solve practical problems occurred after the discovery of the DNA structure led to an understanding of the molecular mechanisms governing DNA replication. DNA strands, unique in every human, are in our cells, where they provide the instructions necessary for life. When DNA replicates, it produces new copies of itself shortly before a cell divides. Understanding DNA replication mechanisms enabled scientists to develop laboratory techniques that researchers now use to identify genetic diseases, pinpoint individuals who were at a crime scene, and determine paternity. Without basic science, it is unlikely that applied science could exist. Another example of the link between basic and applied research is the Human Genome Project, a study in which researchers analyzed and mapped each human chromosome to determine the precise sequence of DNA subunits in each gene's exact location. The gene is the basic unit of heredity, represented by a specific DNA segment that codes for a functional molecule. An individual's complete collection of genes is their genome. Researchers have studied other less complex organisms as part of this project in order to gain a better understanding of human chromosomes. The Human Genome Project relied on basic research with simple organisms and later with the human genome. An important end goal eventually became using the data for applied research, seeking cures and early diagnoses and genetically related diseases. While scientists carefully plan research efforts in both basic science and applied science, note that some discoveries are made by serendipity. That is, by means of a fortunate accident or a lucky surprise. Scottish biologist Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin when he accidentally left a petri dish of Staphylococcus bacteria open. An unwanted mold grew on the dish, killing the bacteria. Fleming's curiosity to investigate the reason behind the bacterial death, followed by his experiments, led to the discovery of the antibiotic penicillin, which is produced by the fungus Penicillium. Even in the highly organized world of science, luck, when combined with an observant, curious mind, can lead to unexpected breakthroughs. Reporting scientific work. Whether scientific research is basic science or applied science, scientists must share their findings in order for other researchers to expand and build upon their discoveries. Collaboration with other scientists when planning, conducting, and analyzing results is important for scientific research. For this reason, important aspects of a scientist's work are communicating with peers and disseminating results to peers. Scientists can share results by presenting them at a scientific meeting or conference, but this approach can reach only the select few who are present. Instead, most scientists present their results in peer-reviewed manuscripts that are published in scientific journals. Peer-reviewed manuscripts are scientific papers that a scientist's colleagues or peers review. These colleagues are qualified individuals, often experts in the same research area, who judge whether or not a scientist's work is suitable for publication. The process of peer review helps to ensure that the research and scientific paper or grant proposal is original, significant, logical, and thorough. Grant proposals, which are requests for research funding, are also subject to peer review. Scientists publish their work so other scientists can reproduce their experiments under similar or different conditions to expand on the findings. A scientific paper is very different from creative writing. Although creativity is required to design experiments, there are fixed guidelines when it comes to presenting scientific results. First, scientific writing must be brief, concise, and accurate. A scientific paper needs to be succinct, but detailed enough to allow peers to reproduce the experiments. The scientific paper consists of several specific sections: introduction, materials and methods, results, and discussion. This structure is sometimes called IMRAD format. There are usually acknowledgement and reference sections as well as an abstract, a concise summary at the beginning of the paper. There might be additional sections depending on the type of paper and the journal where it will be published. For example, some review papers require an outline. The introduction starts with brief but broad background information about what is known in the field. A good introduction also gives the rationale of the work. It justifies the work carried out and also briefly mentions the end of the paper, where the researcher will present the hypothesis or research question driving the research. The introduction refers to the published scientific work of others and therefore require citations following the style of the journal. Using the work or ideas of others without proper citation is plagiarism. Okay, yeah, that's true. Uh, the materials and methods section include a complete and accurate description of the substances the researchers use and the method and techniques they use to gather data. The description should be thorough enough to allow another researcher to repeat the experiment and obtain similar results, but it does not have to be verbose. This section will also include information on how the researchers made measurements and the types of calculations and statistical analyses they used to examine raw data. Although the materials and methods section gives an accurate description of the experiments, it does not discuss them. Some journals require a results section followed by a discussion section, but it is more common to combine both. If the journal does not allow combining both sections, the results section simply narrates the findings without any further interpretation. The researchers present results with tables or graphs, but they do not present duplicate information. In the discussion section, the researchers will interpret the results, describe how variables may be related, and attempt to explain the observations. It is indispensable to conduct an extensive literature search to put the results in the context of previously published scientific research. Therefore, researchers include proper citations in this section as well. Finally, the conclusion section summarizes the importance of the experimental findings. While the scientific paper almost certainly answers one or more scientific questions that the researcher stated, any good research should lead to more questions. Therefore, a well-done scientific paper allows the researchers and others to continue to expand on the findings. Review articles do not follow the IMRAD format because they do not present original scientific findings or primary literature. Instead, they summarize and comment on findings that were published as primary literature and typically include extensive reference sections. Scientific ethics. Scientists must ensure that their efforts do not cause undue damage to humans, animals, or the environment. They also must ensure that their research and communications are free of bias and that they properly balance financial, legal, safety, replicability, and other considerations. All scientists and many people in other fields have these ethical obligations, but those in the life sciences have a particular obligation because their research may involve people or other living things. Bioethics is thus an important and continually evolving field in which researchers collaborate with other thinkers and organizations. They work to define guidelines for current practice and also continually consider new developments and emerging technologies in order to form answers for the years and decades to come. For example, bioethicists may examine the implications of gene editing technologies, including the ability to create organisms that may displace others in the environment, as well as the ability to design human beings. In that effort, ethicists will likely seek to balance the positive outcomes, such as improvised therapies or prevention of certain illnesses, with negative outcomes. Unfortunately, the emergence of bioethics as a field came after a number of clearly unethical practices where biologists did not treat research subjects with dignity and in some cases did them harm. In the 1932 Tuskegee syphilis study, 399 African American men were diagnosed with syphilis but were never informed that they had the disease, leaving them to live with and pass on the illness to others. Hold on one sec. Doctors even withheld proven medications because the goal of the study was to understand the impact of untreated syphilis on black men. While the decisions made in the Tuskegee study are unjustifiable, some decisions are genuinely difficult to make. Bioethicists work to establish moral and dignifying approaches before such decisions come to pass. For example, doctors rely on artificial intelligence and robotics for medical diagnosis and treatment. In the near future, even more responsibility will lie with machines. Who will be responsible for medical decisions? Who will explain to families if a procedure doesn't go as planned? And, since treatments will likely be expensive, who will decide who has access to them and who does not? These are all questions bioethicists seek to answer and are the types of considerations that all scientific researchers take into account when designing and conducting studies. Bioethics are not simple and often leave scientists balancing benefits with harm. In this text and course, you will discuss medical discoveries, vaccines, and research that at their core have an ethical complexity or, in the view of many, an ethical lapse. In 1951, Henrietta Lacks, a 30-year-old African American woman, was diagnosed with cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins Hospital. Unique characteristics of her illness gave her cells the ability to divide continuously, essentially making them immortal. Without her knowledge or permission, researchers took samples of her cells and with them created the immortal HeLa cell line. These cells have contributed to major medical discoveries, including the polio vaccine. Many researchers mentioned in subsequent sections of the text relied on HeLa cell research as at least a component of their work related to cancer, AIDS, cell aging, and even very recently in COVID-19 research. Today, harvesting tissue or organs from a dying patient without consent is not only considered unethical, but illegal, regardless of whether such an act could save other patients' lives. Is it ethical then for scientists to continue to use lax tissues for research, even though they were obtained illegally by today's standards? Should Lax be mentioned as a contributor to the research based on her cells? And should she be cited in the several Nobel Prizes? That have been awarded through such work? Finally, should medical companies be obligated to pay Lax's family, which had financial difficulties, a portion of the billions of dollars in revenue earned through medicines that benefited from HeLa cell research? How would Henrietta Lacks feel about this? Because she was never asked, we will never know. To avoid such situations, the role of ethics in scientific research is to ask such questions before, during, and after research or practice takes place, as well as adhere to establish professional principles and consider the dignity and safety of all organisms involved or affected by the work. Okay. 1.2, themes and concepts of biology. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to do the following: identify and describe the properties of life, describe the levels of organization among living things, recognize and interpret a phylogenetic tree, list examples of different subdisciplines in biology. Drink break. All right. Biology is the science that studies life. But what exactly is life? This may sound like a silly question with an obvious response, but it is not always easy to define life. For example, a branch of biology called virology studies viruses, which exhibit some of the characteristics of living entities but lacks others. Although viruses can attack living organisms, cause diseases, and even reproduce, they do not meet the criteria that biologists use to define life. Consequently, virologists are not biologists, strictly speaking. Similarly, some biologists study the early molecular evolution that gave rise to life. Since the events that preceded life are not biological events, these scientists are also excluded from biology in the strict sense of the term. From its earliest beginnings, biology has wrestled with three questions. What are the shared properties that make something alive? Once we know something is alive, how do we find meaningful levels of organization in its structure? Finally, when faced with the remarkable diversity of life, how do we organize the different kinds of organisms so that we can better understand them? As scientists discover new organisms every day, biologists continue to seek answers to these and other questions. Properties of life. All living organisms share several key characteristics or functions: order, sensitivity, or response to the environment, reproduction, adaptation, growth and development, regulation and homeostasis, energy processing, and evolution. When viewed together, these 8 characteristics serve to define life. Organisms are highly organized, coordinated structures that consist of one or more cells. Even very simple celled organisms are remarkably complex. Inside each cell, atoms form molecules. These in turn form cells, cell organelles, and other cellular inclusions. In multicellular organisms, similar cells form tissues. Tissues, in turn, collaborate to create organs, body structures with a distinct function. Organs work together to form organ systems. Sensitivity or response to stimuli. Organisms respond to diverse stimuli. For example, Plants can bend forward or toward a source of light, climb on fences and walls, or respond to touch. Even tiny bacteria can move toward or away from chemicals, a process called chemotaxis, or light phototaxis. Movement toward a stimulus is a positive response, while movement away from a stimulus is a negative response. Reproduction. Single-celled organisms reproduce by first duplicating their DNA and then dividing it equally as the cell prepares to divide to form two new cells. Multicellular organisms often produce specialized reproductive cells, gametes and oocytes, and sperm cells. After fertilization, the fusion of an oocyte with a sperm cell, a new individual develops. When reproduction occurs, DNA containing genes are passed along to an organism's offspring. These genes ensure that the offspring will belong to the same species and will have similar characteristics such as size and shape. Adaptation. All living organisms exhibit a fit to their environment. Biologists refer to this fit as adaptation, and it is a consequence of evolution by natural selection, which operates in every lineage of reproducing organisms. Examples of adaptations are diverse and unique, from heat-resistant archaea that live in boiling hot springs to the tongue length of a nectar-feeding moth that matches the size of the flower from which feeds it. Adaptations enhance the reproductive potential of the individuals exhibiting them, including their ability to survive and reproduce. Adaptations are not constant. As an environment changes, natural selection causes the characteristics of the individuals in a population to track those changes. Growth and development. Organisms grow and develop as a result of genes providing specific instructions that will direct cellular growth and development. This ensures that a species young will grow up to exhibit many of the same characteristics as its parents. Regulation and homeostasis. Even the smallest organisms are complex and require multiple regulatory mechanisms to coordinate internal functions, respond to stimuli, and cope with environmental stresses. Homeostasis, literally steady state, refers to the relatively stable internal environment required to maintain life. Two examples of internal functions regulated in an organism are nutrient transport and blood flow. Organs, groups of tissues working together, perform specific functions, such as carrying oxygen throughout the body, removing wastes, delivering nutrients to every cell, and cooling the body. In order to function properly, cells require appropriate conditions such as proper temperature, pH, and appropriate concentration of diverse chemicals. These conditions may, however, change from one moment to the next. Organisms are able to maintain homeostatic internal conditions within a narrow range almost constantly, despite environmental changes by activation of regulatory mechanisms. For example, an organism needs to regulate body temperature through the thermoregulation process. Organisms that live in cold climates, such as polar bear, have body structures that help them withstand low temperatures and conserve body heat. Structures that aid in this type of insulation include fur, feathers, blubber, and fat. In hot climates, organisms have methods such as perspiration in humans or panting in dogs that help them shed excess body heat. Energy processing. All organisms use a source of energy for their metabolic activities. Some organisms capture energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy in food. Others use chemical energy in molecules they take in as food. Evolution. The diversity of life on Earth is a result of mutations or random changes in hereditary material over time. These mutations allow the possibility for organisms to adapt to a changing environment. An organism that evolves characteristics fit for the environment will have greater reproductive success, subject to the forces of natural selection. Levels of organization of living things. Living things are highly organized and structured, following a hierarchy that we can examine on a scale from small to large. The atom is the smallest and most fundamental unit of matter that retains the properties of an element. It consists of a nucleus surrounded by electrons. Atoms form molecules. A molecule is a chemical structure consisting of at least two atoms held together by one or more chemical bonds. Many molecules that are biologically important are macromolecules. Large molecules that are typically formed by polymerization. A polymer is a large molecule that is made by combining smaller units called monomers, which are simpler than macromolecules. An example of a macromolecule is deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, which contains the instructions for the structure and functioning of all living organisms. Some cells can contain aggregates of macromolecules surrounded by membranes. We call these organelles. Organelles are small structures that exist within cells. Examples of organelles include mitochondria and chloroplasts, which carry out indispensable functions. Mitochondria produce energy to power the cell, while chloroplasts enable green plants to utilize the energy in sunlight to make sugars. All living things are made of cells. The cell itself is the smallest fundamental unit of structure and function in living organisms. This requirement is why scientists do not consider viruses living. They are not made of cells. To make new viruses, they have to invade and hijack the reproductive mechanism of a living cell. Only then can they obtain the materials they need to reproduce. Some organisms consist of a single cell, and others are multicellular. Scientists classify cells as prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Prokaryotes are single-celled or colonial organisms that do not have membrane-bound nuclei. In contrast, the cells of eukaryotes do have membrane-bound organelles and a membrane-bound nucleus. In larger organisms, cells combine to make tissues, which are groups of similar cells carrying out similar or related functions. Organs are collections of tissues grouped together, performing a common function. Organs are present not only in animals, but also in plants. An organ system is a higher level of organization that consists of functionally related organs. Mammals have many organ systems. For instance, the circulatory system transports blood through the body and to and from the lungs. It includes organs such as the heart and blood vessels. Organisms are individual living entities. For example, each tree in a forest is an organism. Single-celled prokaryote and single-celled eukaryote are also organisms, which biologists typically call microorganisms. Biologists collectively call all the individuals of a species living within a specific area a population. For example, a forest may include many pine trees, which represents the population of pine trees in this forest. Different populations may live in the same specific area. For example, the forest with the pine trees includes populations of flowering plants, insects, and microbial populations. A community is the sum of populations inhabiting a particular area. For instance, all of the trees, flowers, insects, and other populations in a forest form the forest's community. The forest itself is an ecosystem. An ecosystem consists of all the living things in a particular area together with the abiotic, non-living parts of that environment, such as nitrogen in the soil or rainwater. At the highest level of organization, the biosphere is the collection of all ecosystems, and it represents the zones of life on Earth. It includes land, water, and even the atmosphere to a certain extent. A diversity of life. The fact that biology as a science has such a broad scope has to do with tremendous diversity of life on Earth. The source of this diversity is evolution, the process of gradual change in a population or species over time. Evolutionary biologists study the evolution of living things and everything from the microscopic world to ecosystems. A phylogenetic tree can summarize the evolution of various life forms on Earth. It is a diagram showing the evolutionary relationships among biological species based on similarities and differences in genetic or physical traits or both. Nodes and branches comprise a phylogenetic tree. The internal nodes represent ancestors and are points in evolution when, based on scientific evidence, researchers believe an ancestor has diverged to form two new species. The length of each branch is proportional to the time elapsed since the split. Man. I won't read that because that's not part of it. Okay. Branches of biological study. The scope of biology is broad and therefore contains many branches and subdisciplines. Biologists may pursue one of those subdisciplines and work in a more focused field. For instance, molecular biology and biochemistry study biological processes at the molecular and chemical level, including interactions among molecules such as DNA, RNA, and proteins, as well as the way they are regulated. Microbiology, the study of microorganisms, is the study of the structure and the function of single-celled organisms. It is quite a broad branch itself, and depending on the subject of study, there are also microbial physiologists, ecologists, and geneticists, among others. Another field of biological study, neurobiology, studies the biology of the nervous system, and although it is a branch of biology, it is also an interdisciplinary field of study known as neuroscience. Because of its interdisciplinary nature, this subdiscipline studies different nervous system functions using molecular, cellular, developmental, medical, and computational approaches. Paleontology, another branch of biology, uses fossils to study life's history. Zoology and botany are the study of animals and plants, respectively. Biologists can also specialize as biotechnologists, ecologists, or physiologists, to name just a few areas. This is just a small sample of the many fields that biologists can pursue. Biology is the culmination of the achievements of the natural sciences from their inception to today. Excitingly, it is the cradle of emerging sciences, such as the biology of brain activity, genetic engineering of custom organisms, and the biology of evolution that uses the laboratory tools of molecular biology to retrace the earliest stages of life on Earth. A scan of news headlines, whether reporting on immunizations, a newly discovered species, sports doping, or a genetically modified food, demonstrates the way biology is active in and important to our everyday world. End of biology chapter 1.